Good evening. Apologies for the slightly late start. We were having connectivity problems. George Eliot said, "Our dead are never dead to us unless we have forgotten them." Of Larisa Reisner, Trotsky said, "Prominent in the Fifth Army as well as in the revolution as a whole, flashed across the revolutionary sky like a burning meteor, blinding many. She combined a subtle and ironic mind with the courage of a warrior." Now, tonight's broadcast is looking at two books by Cathy Porter, which retrieves Lara Reisner for our memory. Cathy, many of you will know, is a socialist author. She is an author who's produced extensive work on Kollontai, for which she's probably best known, and which certainly informs my work on sexuality. And Cathy has produced these two books, one now out with Haymarket, Lara Reisner, a biography, but also out with Brill and to be out with Haymarket next year, an edited edition of the writings of Lara Reisner. So we're delighted to welcome Cathy to talk to us about her books. Her discussants are distinguished: Segin Boynik, who is the author and overseer of Rab Press, and Alex Spillit, whose recent book, Shape the City, through 1968 Press, made such an impact. Their biographies, of course, and the outline of what the session will be are on the YouTube text below the screen. We're going to go with Cathy talking for about 20-25 minutes. Then we'll have Segin, then we'll have Alex, and there will be time for questions. This is a historical materialism broadcast through Haymarket Books. Haymarket publish historical materialism books and are a leading left-wing publishing house, and historical materialism is a global network which publishes the journal Historical Materialism Researching Critical Marxist Theory, the book series of the same name, Historical Materialism, first with Brill and then with Haymarket, and runs a number of summer schools, conferences, and other events throughout the year, including these broadcasts. We hope you'll be able to support us. But without any further ado, let's ask Cathy to talk about her books. Cathy.
Thank you, Paul, so much for organising this and for everything, and to Historical Materialism for publishing these books. And Alex, I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation at the HM conference about Reissner's life and legacy. You said you were very shocked by that she'd been so scandalously neglected, and I'm sure you're going to have interesting things about why this might be. And thanks to Segin for everything, for all your support and encouragement and your commitment to Reissner's genius, publisher of her final masterpieces on the Decembrists, Russia's First Revolutionaries, written in 1925, the centenary of the uprising, the year before she died. So, heroine of the revolution, role model for the new woman of the revolution. Her short life in the revolution was such an extraordinary one, even in those extraordinary times. It was often hard actually to see her clearly through when I was researching the biography, through the aura of myths and legends surrounding her. Born in 1895, 3 decades after the emancipation of the serfs, she into Russia's highly educated aristocratic elite. She lived through the dying days of the old serf Russia, the new capitalist Russia, the great gulfs of World War, 3 revolutions, Bolshevik power, followed by the 2-year civil war when the massed armies of the capitalist world invaded Russia to bring the Bolsheviks down. On the night of October the 25th, when the Bolsheviks took power, the story went, we don't really know what she did on that night, but the story went anyway, that she sailed up the Neva to the Winter Palace with the sailors. And it was she who gave the orders for the blank cannon to be fired at the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was in session, signaling the birth of the new Russia, the birth of the first workers' government in the world. After October, she worked in Red Petrograd for the commissariats of education and the Navy. And it can't be overstated how unusual this was. Only a tiny number of Russia's intelligentsia supported the Bolsheviks in those early days. A week after the revolution, the Bolsheviks invited Russia's writers and artists to the Smolny to meet the new government and discuss their role in the revolution. According to the Bolshevik journalist Boris Malikov, at 7 p.m, representatives of the capitalist intelligentsia assembled at the Smolny, seated on one sofa. Bock, Mayakovsky, Bock, Meyerhold, and Larisa Reisner. Bock, the great poet, Vsevolod Meyerhold, the great theatre director. So the following summer, when the civil war with the whites and the West and the invading armies of the West began in earnest, she left for the front line of the Civil War, and for the next 2 years she sailed on the great warships of the new Red Fleet, of Trotsky's new Red Fleet, as Commissar, cavalry commander, espionage agent, the only high-ranking woman in the new Soviet fleet, fighting with the sailors in the battles against the whites and the Western armies from the Urals to Persia. After victory, she worked for 2 years in Afghanistan, at the heart of the Bolsheviks' complicated relations with the British imperial power in Asia, as a member of the first Soviet diplomatic mission in Kabul, using the espionage and diplomatic skills she'd learnt at the front to gain access to the emir's harem and persuade his all-important wife and mother of the Bolsheviks' friendly intentions, reporting back to the Comintern in Moscow about British activities in Kabul. In 1923, as Germany was swept with strikes which seemed to be taking the country close to revolution, she worked for the Comintern in Berlin, keeping agents in touch with agents in Dresden and Hamburg, reporting back to Moscow on German workers' lives, the rise of fascism, Hitler's Munich beer hall putsch, and the communist-led workers' uprising in Hamburg. In 1924, she travelled to the industrial heartlands of the new Soviet economy in the Urals and the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, reporting on workers' heroic struggles and sacrifices in dragging the new Soviet economy out of poverty. on the eve of Stalin's 5-year plans. The following year, she revisited Germany, traveling around the country, learning about workers' lives under the new president of the Weimar Republic, former chief of the Kaiser's General Staff, Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who 8 years later would appoint Hitler Chancellor. Her writings from Russia and Ukraine, Germany, Persia, and Afghanistan were read by millions in the new mass circulation Soviet press, and she was generally considered the greatest journalist of the revolution. Special correspondent for Izvestia, the official daily newspaper of the Supreme Soviet. Her journalism was guided by the same Marxist principles as guided the revolution. For a mass movement, resistance movement built from below, refusing to blunt its revolutionary message with calls for gradual reforms from above through the bourgeoisie's sham parliamentary democracy. She was a party writer, but never a party propagandist, whose voice was always uniquely, inimitably her own. Bursting with energy, humor, color, imagination, poetry, and drama. Endlessly, wickedly funny in all sorts of clever, subversive, unexpected ways, particularly at the expense of male pomposity and smugness and all forms of chauvinistic bureaucracy and chauvinism. Her greatest power, though, as a writer, is her vast cast of characters. Hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds of wonderful, wonderful characters. Amazing, unforgettable, cutting from her crowd scenes to her close-ups of individuals, telling their stories and bringing them to life. She had always written poetry as a schoolgirl, mainly on grand historical political themes. After the revolution, she put all her poetry into her journalism, and it was in the revolution that she found her voice as a writer. From Marx, she learned of the contradictions in the social structure that give rise to the forces seeking to destroy it. From Lenin's theoretical treatise, State and Revolution, written on the eve of October, she learnt of the burning urgency of the project to overturn capitalism and end the imperialist slaughter. And she learnt from Lenin of the material forces and processes and communication networks that allow, through which the ideas of the revolution are transmitted and gain social existence. And it was from her life in the revolution that she learnt, that she discovered the revolution's heroism and humanity, the boundless optimism, with all setbacks discussed in terms of how to overcome them, its mighty achievements, lifting millions out of dire poverty, introducing equal pay for women, the 8-hour day, abolishing the Jewish Pale, Tsarist ranks and privileges, offering free healthcare to all citizens, free education to all children in their native language, including Yiddish. And she wrote two of the revolution's mistakes and failures: the corruption and bureaucracy and sexism, and the neglect of workers' needs. And this was always finely balanced with her writings about, always about the sacrifices that were necessary in this new transitional Russia. She derided what she called the soul daubers, who dipped their brushes in the buckets of cheap idealism. She believed journalists should stay as close as possible to the lives of those making the new society, with a minimum of moralizing commentary without varnish or adornment. Workers' struggles and sacrifices give them the right to make to the widest criticisms, she wrote. And the sharper these criticisms are, the more clearly we will see the face of the new Soviet Russia. Journalists of the revolution had to be fighters for the revolution, in her case, literally, writing under fire, taking on the forces of world reaction and counter-revolution, spreading culture and literacy in the midst of war, poverty, and foreign invasion. Finding a new language for the world-shattering events of 1917 that would convey the mass dynamics of the struggle and speak to people. And it was a completely new kind of journalism never seen before in Russia. Frontline, agitprop, and literary. Powerfully, actively involved in the moment, telling the story of the revolution and her life in the revolution. She virtually wrote herself out of her journalism. It was the mass struggle she was interested in, but she was always a powerful presence. Her writing makes her a powerful presence in everything. And turning her journalism into her 6 books allowed her to be more reflective, develop her characters, take more risks, do interesting things with time. These 6 books, the front, Afghanistan, Berlin, October 1923, Hamburg at the barricades, Kolan and Living People, and in Hindenburg's country, are all published together for the first time here in translation as the Biography's companion volume. And they were the basis for this new edition of the Biography. So, a huge amount of material has been released from her archives in the Lenin Library since the first edition, 3 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Memories of her by surviving friends and family members, rehabilitated comrades. Censored Trotsky material, censored from her selected works from the 1960s. her correspondence with Trotsky from Kabul in the 1920s. And as it becomes increasingly difficult to get to Russia for our research, in 2018, invitations were withdrawn over the bombing of Syria and the Skripals. Then lockdown, now, for obvious reasons. But we're fortunate to be able to continue our research online with the digitized archives of the Lenin Library, Cyberlinka. There's so many of these archive sources. The journals, Red Archive and Historical Archives, the archives of the Revolutionary Military Soviet of the Republic for a lot of the Trotsky material, the Electronic National Library, the Library Literature and Life. She is, needless to say, untranslatable, terribly difficult to translate, fiendishly difficult. And it sometimes seems crazy trying, actually, and particularly now, when, heaven forbid, anybody should know anything about Russia and its people and history and be inspired by her, find her writings a source of inspiration. So, sorry, I just have to move the light a bit because sorry. But, you know, more and more the more I read, you know, the slow reading involved in translating her over the years keeps revealing new ways in which she tells us about the world we're living in now. I mean, particularly, you know, time and again, we see how her relevance, particularly, I was really struck in the last few weeks as our government shamefully agreed to freeze funds to the UN agency supporting Palestinian refugees, effectively starving them to death. I made this particular connection when I learned about this with her essay Fascists in Asia, in which she identifies the origins of the new doctrine of fascism in the gangster politics of colonialism and British imperial power in Asia. The essay was written in 1922, in just the weeks after Mussolini's march on Rome to save Italy from Bolshevism. Published as the rousing finale to her book, Afghanistan, and also separately as a popular pamphlet. And for anyone tempted to downplay the importance of the January the 6th Capitol riots, I think the essay should be required reading. Also, of course, connected to her account of of Hitler's Beerholt putsch a year later, which was not successful, which was closer, I suppose, more comparable to the January the 6th riot. So, writing from Weimar, Germany, a year later, a decade before Hitler, she described the wreckage of human society that produced the Nazis' insane dreams of race extermination and world domination, accusing the fake socialist social democrats in power in Germany of normalizing fascism, or how she puts it, brainwashing people to accept that the unnatural as natural. When 2 weeks ago, when the wonderful Irish KC presented South Africa's case to the ICG on Israel's normalization of its genocide against the Palestinian people, it was Reissner's voice I heard. And what better time to be discussing her now, with the mass Palestine rallies across the world, which truly look like the beginning of something different and hopeful and new, a new spirit of resistance, the start of a genuine mass movement from below against the criminals in power. She tells us how people made the revolution and how the revolution made them, and she shows us the forces they were up against and that they could be beaten. And like our hero, Julian Assange, tortured and jailed for exposing the truth of imperialism's crimes, she has been viciously slandered and attacked. And I've seen this in the publication of this work, first and the second edition of the biography. The first edition, all sorts of nasty pieces about her, source-free, accusing her of sleeping with all the party leaders, sleeping her way to the top, deriding her writings as without literary merit. So I have to bring this up again, that the most venomous of these pieces appeared in a special little box at the top next to her picture when just after the second edition of the biography was published. The two links to this piece were published with my biography way down below, portraying her as a sort of subhuman, an animal. No, sorry, that's rude to animals. You know what I mean? I mean, uneducated, subhuman monster of depravity. That's there. I mean, as I said to Sezgin and other people, if that's the best they can do, it's sort of rehashed from 30 years ago, but nevertheless, it's very disturbing. So note that in Russia too, I suppose, I don't know if you know about the 8-part biopic, the Trotsky, was put out by Channel 1 in Russia to mark the centenary of the revolution, in which Trotsky is a sort of leather-jacketed, sadistic leader of Jewish cabal seeking world domination, and Reissner is his chief groupie in heavy makeup, groaning and writhing with him on his train, his special train. then they get to the battlefield at Sviazhsk and ordered 1 in 10 of the sailors to be brought out and shot. So various the women who fought for the revolution have always been favorite targets of the enemies of the revolution in Russia and the West. And with her free spirit and her wildness, she was always she always came in for the worst of it. A Bolshevik hack, parading around right in the Empress's stolen furs and diamonds while Russia starved, playing sex games with her victims in the Civil War and then torturing them to death. It has to be talked about. It's terribly upsetting. The latest shocker was published just a few months after the second edition of the biography. Interesting timing. Was by German novelist Stefan Kopetzky about Nazi mystery man von Niedermeyer, which is a sort of flexible narrative. Really, you can say anything about anybody. You don't really know much about von Niedermeyer. So anyway, it's about his plans to take his secret armaments project with this hideous, kinky Reissner, and their plans to take over the world. Which I must just read what he says in his extremely portentous, frightening way. Or maybe I didn't write it down. Horrible. Which has had anyway, their plans to take over the world, which it must be borne in mind is just a complete pile of unsourced tosh, which has had a catastrophic effect on the whole course of the 20th century and the history of Russia. This is a book that has been well reviewed, highly publicized, reference to it, just bang opposite my book, but of equal value. Not a word of truth in it. And I must confess myself that I have, to my shame, I laughed at one of the stories about her, which is that she conducted her Comintern work in Kabul naked, covered only in a fur coat. I mean, I can't tell you how ridiculous this is, because she had to be, she wasn't allowed out of the embassy in Kabul, without a posse of guards, and she had to be heavily veiled in the heat of, anyway, utterly ludicrous. I know exactly where the story comes from, and it may be very amusing, but the party, to its shame, believed the story and threatened her with expulsion, and it made her life extremely difficult. And she would laugh these things off, but we then come to the sort of one of the central problems is that she was never involved in the politics of women's liberation. She worked with men. Her friendships were with men. She believed in women fighting shoulder to shoulder with men in the common struggle. And she she defended herself as a writer, but she never defended herself as a woman. And she was attacked very viciously as a woman in her lifetime and after her death. So I'm defending her for her. So the problem I think when we think about why she's been so neglected, well, her message is extremely dangerous, obviously. And good, I'm so glad that it is. She doesn't fit into the Kollontai women's rights box, and nor does she fit into the Trotsky box, so beloved of much of the left. She was very close to Trotsky. Of course, there were numerous rumors that she had an affair with Trotsky. I think it's highly unlikely, but anyway, but she did not support Trotsky's platform on the unions in the crucial debate on the trade unions in 1920. And nor was she ever involved in the workers' opposition. In the left opposition, or the workers' opposition. She was not an oppositionist. She was critical. She was critical of the party, and never, of course, a Stalin apologist. But she is hard for many on the left to categorize, and I think this makes her this partly explains perhaps why she's not as known as she should be. But I just want to perhaps end by going back to the Decembrists, her work on the Decembrists, which I just think are so beautiful and poetic. And she would have written so much more if she'd lived longer. But it's kind of it was very challenging for me to, like all my writing, but it was very challenging for me to discover this epoch of history, before Lenin. Lenin wrote a great deal and very interestingly about the Decembrists, but she was writing about this struggle before Lenin, before mass struggle. It's kind of taking us back to the ABCs of the revolution, and I think perhaps that's where we need to go now. Because it's when you're part of those huge mass demonstrations in London, and you see this real thirst for history, and if only, and I just do hope that Reissner's message and her writings somehow make this vital connection with what's happening on the streets, because that's why I write about her.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Cathy, for that very much informed overview of your publication. Sagan, would you like to go next?
Yes, thanks. Well, I'm really happy to be able to speak about Larisa Reisner's work with Cathy and others. Actually, I'm not an expert, or I haven't systematically studied Larisa Reisner's work. But for years, I had this fascination, sort of like really enthusiasm to read her writings, because they are very strong. And the language that she is using to describe this, like these episodes of civil war, and after the post-revolutionary situation, not only in Russia, but also in Afghanistan and Germany, are just, as you said, very distinctive. And there's like nothing like that existed before in Russia. And of course, she had a lot of admirers, like from Viktor Shklovsky to Karel Radek and Trotsky, that Cathy already mentioned. So yes, in fact, I am not in a. I am very happy to speak about, let's say, my interest on Larissa's, but also I have to like. I'm very happy that soon we're gonna publish Cathy's translation of Larissa's, let's say, a final work, which was planned as a whole book on Decembrists, but she managed to publish only 4 writings, like 1 it's general on Decembrist, and 3 focusing on the figures like Kakowski, Trubetskoy, and Stengel. They are really fascinating and quite an ironic writings, because as Cathy just presented, her background was from a wealthy bourgeois privileged family, so she could very well analyze the psychological types of that, let's say, failed attempt of the aristocratic revolution, but nevertheless democratic revolution, as it was against the absolute power of Tsar. So before all these translations, what one could read in English of Larissa's writings was from Pluto Press, Richard Chappell's book, translated in 1977, called Hamburg at the Barricades, and other some collections. The book is interesting also with its inclusion of the text by Karel Radek, portion from Trotsky, and the writing of Viktor Shklovsky, which are very interesting also, how they situate and how they look at the very form, especially if we speak about Viktor Shklovsky's writings, very form interesting and a distinctive form of Larissa's writings. So this was all what one could read in English, and just there was a myth around Larissa's writings. Only thing that we could find was Cathy's biography, which was published in 1988, Virago Press, a small edition, and that was like perhaps the only presentation of her work which is not based on these myths of, let's say, really showing her as a monster, as just like someone around Trotsky and this, when I remember I first read this book, I was impressed with what Cathy presented her writings and her work as like that. I'm just quoting now. She was part of the elemental struggle for the new Russia, and that her writings, even though she was a party writer, as you said, she was not an oppositional. She was not an oppositionist who gave her full support to the new proletarian literature of the revolution, and her works filled with party spirit. But like the fellow travelers, she often exposed the gaps between slogans and reality in her writing. I think this way how you present Larissa, you can see very clearly that her initial involvement with the Russian avant-garde, especially the Acmeists and some of the symbolists and early futurist poetry and art, really continued to influence during her very political writings. And this tension perhaps is what makes her writings so interesting. Larissa herself wrote about that style as well. I just quote 2 very, very, let's say, a strong statement, reflections. One is saying, I want to write poems about biology and scientific problems from a feeling of a protest. And this, I think, is really summarizes her writing style, but also tells that you, Cathy, in a book also quite you give a space and discuss of her early formation in Vladimir Bekhteyev's Neurophysiology Institute, which was very important and progressive, not only for Larisa Reisner, but also for film directors like Dziga Vertov. And so this idea of like combining this revolutionary uprising with science and poetry, I think it's like really condensed in Larisa Reisner quite interestingly. And also I want to quote one of her another statement about like style of writing, which is I'm taking it from Virago edition. It's a quote from her, a poem. There's nothing more harmful than cemeteries, memories, and sentimental strolls around one's own ruins. So, of course, to write a biography of Larisa Reisner and to keep her form, let's say, her expression is quite a challenging. And I think this book of yours, both editions, and especially the expanded new second edition, does a lot of, like, let's say, helps a lot for us to really understand these contradictions and the difficult paths in how her style is formed. I also want to mention a few interesting stuff that while being fascinated by her writings and try to collect or let's say make the initial bibliographical research, I came across some interesting materials. So yes, Larisa's work is pretty obscure, like pretty unknown, let's say, not anymore, luckily, I have to say, but until recent times. And but nevertheless, there are some very interesting publications from different corners of the world that have translated or dealt with her work. I said in English language, one could read this Pluto Press 1977 book and a few others articles. But in Yugoslavia, in Kingdom of Yugoslavia, in 1935, her writing on Afghanistan was translated. For example, that is an interesting thing to mention, including also, it was published in Zagreb in Serbo-Croatian translation, including also the writings from the front. And the front perhaps is Larisa's most known reprinted red text, especially popular, as you mentioned, among the Trotskyists, because, you know, without Sviazhak, perhaps the Russian Revolution would not be saved, as Larisa herself is writing about. But in 1920, these were writings of Larisa from Civil War period, 1919-1920, which then she collected in 1924 in the special book published by journal Krasnaya Nova, Red Virgin Soil, as a book, and she wrote a new introduction to this edition, which is quite interesting. And I recommend everyone whoever will now read this new historical materialism collection of 6 books will start with that Larisa's short introduction to her writings on the front, which is amazing because in 1924, after all that changes, all the post-Civil War traumas and tensions and difficult moments and the unresolved contradictions of NEP, new economy policy, of course, it was a different situation to write about these very heroic moments. And with that, she also changed her style, because if you read the first essays published in the front, in beginning of 20s, you can still find the traces of this Acmeist, symbolist, very complicated, almost like impossible to translate metaphors and metonyms and all these heavy language constructions, difficult language constructions. And she writes that she in fact wants to learn to write simple. Wants to learn to write the simple from workers writers, which was very popular in Krasnaya Nova, in Red Virgin Soil, and to clean herself from all that heaviness, to clean herself from like Akhmatova for to start with, which was like, I guess she had a very complicated relation with, and so no wonder that her writings was quite influential to, even though they were not oppositionist writings, were very much an influence to Russian formalists, primarily Viktor Shklovsky, but also to artists that were thinking about their devices, about their artistic forms, and trying to reflect the importance of these devices in their work. So, as I said, we are now publishing Cathy's translation of Decembrists' writings. These are writings which Shklovsky thought that were the best writings of Larissa's. Unfortunately, she wrote only 4 and died of malaria, young age, not even 30 years old, in the 1926. So she died when these the 2 last let's say portraits of Decembrists. I don't remember exactly which ones were. I think Steingel and Kakowski were published in Krasnaya Nova. The same number, February issue 26, also published her obituary. And this is pretty, a strong picture when you look at these old issues of Krasnaya Nova, and to see like how this history was played out so quickly that time. Things has changed like quite I guess say drastically. And so of course she won herself out. This was not only malaria, this was like living 3-4 life in from after the revolution. And these are really fascinating writings. As Shklovsky said, her and others said, her swan songs, because about the Decembrist literature, there are quite many writings about Decembrist wives, for example, for some reason, like the way how they followed the Decembrists who were sent to Siberia and all that. But nothing of that concerns Larisa. She's just like writing about the corruption, and, as you said, this like chauvinism of this male world within the aristocratic world. And this is quite funny, ironic, and very well researched writings. So Shklovsky also signaled that this perhaps would be the future of the history writing. So, which is really pity that we don't have more of this kind of writings about history, which is not impartial writings. And I have to say also that Cathy's writings are not indifferent writings. It's not an indifferent, impartial, distant writings about Larisa. So when you read the book, which was published by Historical Materialism, the second edition of it, Biography, you can also have these detours, these openings on the recent politics from Ukraine to the British imperialism and then all that stuff. So it is really a very strong literature. And as I said, yes, Larisa Reisner perhaps it's not as popular as one would like to, but has an interesting popularity. I found quite an interesting magazine published in Finland, which carried Larissa's picture on the cover from 1928, Itaja Lansi, which is like East and West, and published in Finnish language when the communist movement was quite persecuted and illegal in Finland. Published her short introduction to the reprint of the writings to the front, which is the strongest, where she says we shouldn't be allergic toward the simplicity and rudeness of the workers' expressions. You know, there is some philosophy also in that rude expressions of the denial of the bourgeois culture and all that. So, and after publishing, which soon, within some months, we will publish this small book that Cathy done for Rabrat. And I'm so happy to publish this with Cathy's introduction as well. We are also doing a small book that I want here briefly to mention and finish on a film that Harun Farokhi did with Ingemar Engström in 1975. So Farokhi, most of who listen would know with his works dealing with especially now actual issues of war ideology and capitalism and how this is all related. But he in 75 worked with Finnish-Swedish filmmaker Ingemar Engström, who is mostly known for her long essay film based on Anna Seger's novel Transit. So in 75, they made a film called About Narration, Erzählen, which deals with Larisa Reisner. It's actually, it is an essay film on how one can make a film, what sort of forms, what kind of like approach cinematic devices we need if we decide to make a film about such a militant figure full of contradictions. It's an extremely interesting film, tries with a lot of Russian formalists, including Yuri Lotman's idea of how narrative is built and all that semiotical formulas that Farokhi especially was obsessed, but as a very interesting approach on this tension of this what kind of what is the cinema, what is the film that would tell the life of Larisa. And there is an interview, I think this was perhaps 2 years before he died, with Karl Retzlaff, who was a member of German Communist Party in 20s already, and who met Larisa with Karl Radek in Berlin. It's very interesting interview. Perhaps last like 4 or 5 minutes, but now we're gonna reprint this. So where he says, perhaps if Larisa Reisner, because like the interviews ask, what do you think? What would happen to Larisa? What would happen to Larisa if she lived in Stalin's Russia, you know? And he has an interesting idea, like perhaps more Larissa's or Larisa herself would be the genuine answer to the Stalin and also to fascism. So it's very interesting memory. But yeah, I will stop here. And again, thanks Cathy for making this possible. So yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Sergen. Alex.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this book launch. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you, Cathy, for asking me to be part of it. Thank you, Paul, for doing the tech, and to HM for this. And thank you also, Cathy, for bringing Larisa Reisner's work to a wider audience, of course, but also a personal thank you for getting me into her writing. Because as Cathy had mentioned earlier, I had heard of Larisa Reisner briefly in passing several times, as one does when you're part of the Marxist left. Just one of many names that sort of flashes across your screen. But I had never really fully engaged with her work until Cathy and I spoke on the same panel at HM in London this past fall, or this past autumn. And Cathy and I had a wonderful conversation afterwards, and I made it a point to engage more with her work, and that was made a lot easier with the volume of Reisner's writings, which Cathy was kind enough to send me, so that I could be part of this event. And it's everything. I won't repeat what everyone has said already, except just to emphasize that there is such a fierce grace in everything that Reisner has written, and her ability to get very quickly to the core of any of the arguments, but without sacrificing the beauty and the heroism, for lack of a better term, of what it means to actually be a revolutionary, to fight for a better world, a fundamentally different world that is more fundamentally democratic and equal. But what stuck out to me the most is the way in which Reisner's work seems to play on this very potent dialectic, this potent conversation between catastrophe and the promise of revolution, specifically the kind of utopian dimensions of revolution, which I think as Marxists, sometimes we get a little skittish when we want to talk about utopia. But it's part of what we do. It's part of how we operate. And I think we need to regard that, just as the fact that apocalypse is actually part of our is part of how we operate. It's part of the Marxist heuristic, the revolutionary Marxist heuristic in particular. And so I've just written a few remarks actually on how that dialectic plays out in Reisner's Poetics, that I hope will add to some of this discussion. It is often forgotten that the Russian Revolution took place in the midst of apocalypse. I think even among the revolution's defenders, stubborn though we may be, we have a tendency to downplay this reality. There's many reasons for this. Perhaps it's an attempt to refute the arguments of the establishment, which tends to say that the revolution itself was actually an apocalypse. In any event, whatever the reason is, we diminish the degree in much of how we talk about the revolution. We diminish the degree to which events that surrounded the revolution made most of Russia, Europe, and the rest of the world tremble at the prospect of oblivion. It wasn't just the profound inequality, the unrelenting poverty, the horrendous working conditions that industrialized capitalism had imposed on people's lives. It wasn't just that working people were exposed to starvation, disease, destitution, critical injury, or even death. These had well before 1917 become commonplace. Rather, it was the way in which industrialized war and empire seem to accelerate these in the form of plummeting living conditions, collapsing stability, and the wholesale slaughter of working people. We often forget that before the Second World War, the First World War was referred to as the Great War. And I think it's a fitting appellation. This was, after all, not only the first war to involve virtually every known nation and territory on what was by then a thoroughly globalized, integrated planet. Not only this, but the Great War was the first modern war. It was the first war where all of the technological capacities and industrial marvels of capitalism were directed toward making mass murder more efficient than ever. Telegraph and newspapers ensured that most people knew about the latest massacre, the latest bloodbath within days, each report describing how yet another town or field had been reduced to a smoldering stretch of mud and corpses and barbed wire. The end of the world to many working people then during World War I seemed quite possible. Indeed, more likely than anyone could really ever remember. Events leading up to the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd confirm as much. And China Mieville, in his wonderful book on the Russian Revolution, October, the story of the revolution, it chronicles the breakdown in order and some of the horrendous murders and crimes that had started to seize Petrograd in the lead up to the revolution, as the provisional government just simply lost any ability to impose authority. It's important to keep this in mind, because otherwise we risk forgetting just how much was at stake to the revolutionary workers who took over the factories, the peasants who rose up in the country, the soldiers and sailors who turned their rifles on their commanding officers. Yes, these were people for whom history had left no choice, but they were also gripped by the idea that they could make the future into something so much better. In other words, I would say that the Russian Revolution forged one of the primary dialectics of the 20th century, the idea that utopia had to be and could be snatched from the jaws of apocalypse and Armageddon. Rosa Luxemburg's Socialism or Barbarism made vividly real. And this dialectic, as I said earlier, infuses the poetics of Larisa Reisner's writings. We know, of course, that Reissner was not just a writer, but a revolutionary activist and diplomat, as has been discussed earlier, and someone who put the survival of the revolution first. But Reissner doesn't merely recount events, as which is always necessary in journalists, but her writings have such a more vivid tone compared to, say, very essential books, which I'm not degrading here, like John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. I would argue that the way that Reissner writes about the revolution is so much more vivid and immediate than either of those two works, essential though they are. What Reissner's reports convey is the specific structure of feeling from a literary perspective, the way in which revolutionary situations tightly wind together hope and despair, destruction and creativity, the beauty and heroism of self-sacrifice, along with the devastating losses of battle. This is easily dramatized in her work at the front of the Civil War, when a dozen plus imperialist armies essentially tried to crush the revolution using the same tanks and guns and technology that had already sent millions to their graves. Reissner's description of the Red Army's defense of towns like Kazan and Sviazhsk, of a rural village reduced to what she called, quote, a Goya-esque vision of hell. The contrast between blown-up railroad trains and the shores of the Caspian Sea, the magnificent architecture of Astrakhan towering over nearby swamps and steppes. These all paint for us a picture of a massive and ancient region in dramatic flux, thrust from backwardness into a struggle between radically different and competing visions of the future. Trotsky, who of course was an effusive admirer of Reissner's work, would no doubt find resonance in these scenes. It was his specific formulations of uneven and combined development, built on those of Marx and Alexander Parvus, that explained how Russia had become ripe for a socialist revolution, not despite its temporal juxtaposition, but because of it, precisely because of it. The ways in which modernity had thrust itself on an empire of illiterate and isolated peasants, jarring them into the conditions of cosmopolitanism and collective struggle. These are all well documented in Russia in the early 20th century, and they set the stage for how history's most anachronized, most left behind, might also step into the vanguard of history. Reissner's writings highlight these dizzying contradictions and the fierce struggles that they produced. She noted them across Russia, Ukraine, and beyond, and she hinted at these same potentials when she described Afghanistan during her time there as a diplomat. She described workshops and mills carved into the sides of mountains, where iron looms drowned out the sound of nearby bazaars through stone walls that could have been hundreds of years old. Conditions were cruel and oppressive, more akin to indentured servitude. Even here, though, we see Reissner observe hope in the cracks of uneven and combined development. Again, she uses the works, interestingly enough, of Francisco Goya. She mentions Goya to describe these conditions, and again sees them as yielding this kind of revolutionary utopian possibility. For sure, these are the kinds of conditions that can just as easily pave the way for fascism, as she mentions in her Fascists in Asia essay, highlighting the examples of British colonialism. But this same wildly contradictory reality also creates fractures and gaps through which movements and consciousness of liberation might pass. Yet here in Kabul's old fortress, Reissner wrote, where workers are beaten with sticks and the living corpses of children and old men cut the cloths of their shrouds with the scissors of Goya's devils, the proletarian yeast is rising. If possessions could bring happiness or unhappiness, I wouldn't envy the owners of the cloaks and blankets made from this cloth, steeped in healthy class hatred. It is, however, worth stressing that Reissner didn't just identify these frictive conditions, these frictive histories in underdeveloped nations. Her time in Germany, which was then, we should keep in mind, the most advanced industrial power in Europe, also finds these same patterns between deprivation and struggle, revolutionary struggle. Here in the Weimar Republican interregnum between the fall of Kaiser Wilhelm and the rise of Hitler's Nazis, German society buckled under its own weight. The contrast between industrial strength and urbanization, cultural decadence, and abject deprivation is again illustrated as backdrop for revolutionary possibility. Berlin is starving, she wrote in 1923. Starvation haunts the buses, shutting its eyes on the spinning upper decks to the advertisements, desolation and motor horns, reeling past like drunks. In Hamburg, meanwhile, overcrowded dormitories and dreary town squares, miles from the factories and shipyards, serve as the setting for fierce debates between workers and union bureaucrats, communists and social democrats. One gets the sense that Reissner's eye, therefore, wasn't merely keen for the contradictions of uneven and combined development, as well as the more catastrophic, ruinous, Goya-esque characteristic of post-Great War capitalism. Rather, she sees them as dialectically inextricable, as bound together. Not altogether unlike, this reminds me anyway of what Evan Calder-Williams describes as combined and uneven apocalypse, as he calls it in his 2011 book of the same name. Just as capitalism's spread will leap over and subsume in its path everything it has yet to devour, so will its collapse give way to tears in the social fabric of daily life. That which is once paradise is now host to wreckage. If this is true, then there is another heuristic, I would argue, stalking Reissner's Poetics, and that is the heuristic of redemption, not in the biblical sense, but in the sense of a kind of secular theology akin to what Walter Benjamin describes in his concept of history. This is redemption as making whole, a bringing together of the fragments left behind by the catastrophe of unilinear progress, history's detritus suddenly seizing and reshaping what had once shaped them. Now, Walter Benjamin and Larisa Reisner never crossed paths. Benjamin did visit Soviet Russia, of course, in 1926, but it was several months after Reisner's untimely death at the age of 30. We do know that Benjamin had at least a passing familiarity with Reisner's work. She was one of many topics related to Soviet culture introduced to Benjamin by his lover, the Latvian Bolshevik actor and avant-garde theater director Asha Lassis. And if Lassis is understood as the decisive influence in Benjamin's conversion to Marxism, then those familiar with both his work and that of Reisner may be able to pick out where their preoccupations overlap, despite some very different approaches to both the principles of materialism and socialist revolution. Both were acutely aware of the catastrophes that lay in front of them, that history and capitalism had produced. Both were also aware, however, that capitalism's catastrophes made and illustrated how history was incredibly contingent, that it was a very contingent process. Though events may bring us to the precipice of several specific outcomes, no one outcome is guaranteed more than another. Whether the prospect of apocalypse or of mass collapse and extermination comes in the form of barbed wire or mustard gas on one hand, or in our own time, through an ecological balance popping at the seams, I would argue it's only through facing these catastrophes that we can hope to suss out the edges and contours of a socialist future. That future, as always, is a gamble, though a surprisingly resilient one. Once in a century, people discover a new truth, which they defend to the last drop of their blood, wrote Reissner. And mixed with these beautiful words, terrible in their beauty, is the smell of sweat, the living breath of those sleeping next to each other on the floor. No nightmares, no sentimentality. Tomorrow someone will die, knowing in their last moments that death is only one of many possibilities, not the main one at all, and that the city still hasn't been taken, and that the message scribbled in chalk on the dirty wall, "Workers of the world unite," is still there. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. Okay, we're not yet getting much questions from the audience, although the audience are showing an appreciation. So let me provoke you with 2 or 3 comments of my own. I'm relatively recent to Reisner's writings. Really, when we first proposed this session, and I thought it's best to get some reading in. But one of the things that strikes me about this, and one of historical materialism's missions, is retrieving extraordinary lives. I mean, this is a woman who was in Red Petrograd as a Commissar of Education in the Navy, went to the front lines of a civil war when women were prejudiced against for doing so, sailed on warships of the Red Navy, was the only high-ranking woman in the fleet, fought against the whites, traveled widely within and without the new Soviet Union, an extraordinary life to pack in for 30 years, and also produces that documentation of life in the revolution. And I think that life in the revolution is extraordinarily important. I read a lot of theoretical or conceptual material and enjoy it as I enjoy Pollock or Mondrian when I go, even Picasso when I go to galleries. But having that concrete sense of living a revolution, not just easy slogans about, bloodshed, actually describing the moments of bloodshed and the aftermath and those preparations beforehand. that seems to put colour to the monochrome. It seems to, for me, to answer to a degree some of Traverso's very interesting observations on a left melancholia. And for my own thinking around left melancholia, I think Reisner is an example I might use for what I would call left phlegmatism. Against the storm, but still prevailing. So I think it's really important to have this living revolution and the quality of the writings, which takes you there, which reminds you we're talking about people, we're talking about circumstances, we're talking about context and conjunctures that are real. And in that sense, I think Alex in particular is quite right to emphasize that dialectics of passion and analysis, where sometimes Marxists are either all passion on the streets and too little analysis, or they're all analysis, journal articles, and not living what the consequences of their theory might be. The other thing that strikes me about her is I wonder how far you would agree that gender has played a major part in her being overlooked. If you think about Guevara and Cuba and then Africa in the 1950s and 60s, here's a revolutionary, writes about revolution and is an icon. If you think about the icons of the Russian Revolution, a life like this, I think, if not a woman's life, would be far better known, would have been far better written about, which is why we have to thank Cathy for pulling this up to our attention, producing these 2 volumes. We have to thank Sagan for putting a 3rd volume on the later writings out shortly. So I just wanted to actually provoke you to think a little bit about those themes. And you can come in however you want. Cathy?
Yes. Well, there's so much to say, isn't there? I mean, she, as far as gender goes, you know, she operates in a world of men. All her friends, right from her college years, from her university years, were men. She had absolutely no interest in, like Rosa Luxemburg, she was just not interested in the politics of women's liberation. She took for granted all the benefits that the revolution had brought to women. So, and that an earlier Colantine, an earlier generation of women had been fighting for. And then, of course, there are all the things that she didn't. I mean, she didn't write about herself, her personal life at all. She barely wrote about herself in any way, but never about her personal life. A little bit of the first chapter of the front. But we do know, you know, and in researching the book, I did find some very tragic things about her. You know, for instance, she was abused by her husband, beaten badly. That whole story that I talked about with the naked and the fur coat thing, you know, was a product of his, obviously a product of his jealous and insanely jealous imagination. She sort of laughed it off, and of course, you know that the Bolsheviks had committed themselves. I mean, quite apart from all the benefits to women, which Kollontai actually said will remain. Probably most of them will remain on paper, you know, due to poverty, war, male chauvinism, and so on. But nevertheless, and the intention was good. Amongst all the, you know, the new marriage laws, the legalization of abortion, you know, was the criminalization of domestic abuse, which was categorized as a counter-revolutionary offense, punishable by jail. Now, it's just fantastic. You know, we have to just remember what the old marriage law, you know, for instance, before the revolution, sanctioned by the church, which sanctioned wife beating, encouraged wife beating. The rod was to be kept over the bed, you know. So these are incredibly revolutionary moves. But, you know, it was Lenin who talked about, what does he talk about, the the vile remnants of bourgeois marriage or something. So we see this. Reissner didn't talk about her marriage at all, or her relationships at all, but she was beaten, she was humiliated. We have to say that, and so this is why Lenin's words are very potent, the vile remnants. You don't just tell women to take paths they've never traveled before, overnight. And, it's very difficult and very easier for her in her 20s, without children. Another terribly sad and shocking thing for me was that she suffered 3 miscarriages, I should say, which I found very sad. She desperately wanted a child. And of course, she was, when she had all her miscarriages, legalization, abortion had been legalized, but it was a very vicious, painful, and cruel operation, and miscarriages were treated the same way. You get on with it. No anesthetic used. Her last miscarriage, for instance, was a very late one. Which is particularly traumatic and painful and physically dangerous. And but then she was still terribly young. I mean, for us, as she said in her introduction to the front, the revolution has made martyrs of so many of its fighters. There were quite a few, but people just drove themselves to the limit, died of all sorts of, mainly, of course, of epidemics, influenzas, all sorts of things during the Civil War, those who weren't actually killed in the fighting. She drove herself to the limit. She died very stupidly, really, of typhoid fever, and just, on dirty milk. It wasn't a heroic death on the battlefield as it should have been. But anyway, just a roundabout way of answering your question about gender. She simply just lived as a man, defending herself with her fists when necessary, and honing her tremendous skills for puncturing male egos. That she was very good at that, and had to be, working. And it was not just a simple. I mean, a lot of women fought in the Civil War in the army, in the Red Army, but virtually none of them went into the Navy. It was probably the same the world over. That women are thought to bring bad luck to ships. And she had quite a few battles, quite apart from the fighting on the front line of the Civil War. She had to fight for her right to be listened to and respected as a woman.
Sagan, Alex, would you like to add anything?
Not particularly, but perhaps Cathy, you can correct me if I am wrong. But I recently read Victor Serge memoirs of revolutionary, and for example, he mentions meeting Radek in Berlin.
So I'm so sorry, I didn't really hear that.
I say, like, you can correct me if I am wrong, but like I think also Victor Serge, for example, in his memoirs doesn't mention Larisa, even though he mentions meeting Radek in Berlin with a very young and pretty woman. And then that's maybe telling a little bit of what Paul asked, like about like why she's not some mention known, or I don't know. I'm just asking you if you know if it's in
Oh,
sales.
I don't really know what your question is. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, just about their relationship in general. I'm sorry, I'm not.
No, it's Alex. Maybe you want to say something.
Yeah, I think I think what Sagan is getting at is there's a moment in Victor Serge's Memoirs of a Revolutionary where he talks about meeting Karl Radek with, quote, a young pretty girl, and I think we're trying to figure out whether that the woman in question is actually Reissner, because that would further highlight the sexism that sort of has unfairly obscured her from the. I won't add more, and I don't know if Cathy, you have an answer to that, if we know that person is Reissner or not, but you know, but I won't add much more than what other people have already said. I think just to highlight, I think so much of Reissner's memory after she passed away could only have been further obscured by the fact that Stalinism itself did actually roll back so many of the gains that women made in the revolution. You know, like new restrictions were placed on abortion again. You have the replacements of International Women's Day with Mother's Day. These are very real things that I think sort of certainly didn't help the memory of Reissner or the accessibility to her writings, which of course continues through to today. Well, you know, 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. I will say that yes, there's to what Paul said about the left melancholia and left phlegmatism very much resonates me. It's this there is this notion in Reissner's work, or this feeling, the structure of feeling, as I like to say, per Raymond Williams, that the horrors persist, but so do I. You know, like, and we're gonna keep trudging through this, and that's very much what the feeling that I get from a lot of her writings, and I think actually you illustrated it really well. You know, the melancholia that is necessary to be a revolutionary and to actually participate honestly in activism, which requires theory, just as theory requires activism, and that sort of balance to be able to admit when something has been defeated, even if it hasn't been fully defeated. You know, that there's something really always tragic about what we do, but the tragedy doesn't eliminate our ability to experience the softer and more beautiful sides of life. And there's that give and pull, the dialectic as they have with each other. I'll stop there.
I mean, just to come in, one of the things I find interesting about that observation, she dies before we begin to really see the decline of the Soviet experiment into Stalinism. So while there has been a movement back from war communism to new economic policy, and they are operating a siege communism rather than a progressive communism, nevertheless, what she's doing is writing at a time when the battle is in, as opposed to when the battle has been won or lost. And I think that perspective is extraordinary as well, because too many people whose writings we're familiar with, who then lived through parts of Stalinism, their views of the Russian Revolution and the attempts to liberate and emancipate thereafter are colored by their then later memory of Stalinism. So she's giving us a slice of life during, and a unique slice of life, which is not colored by later reminiscences. In that respect, I think an extraordinarily valuable thinker. But I also, when I was talking about gender, I was very much talking about her reception, and her reception, particularly after her death. And in that sense, the genderedness of her reception as much as the genderedness that ensued in terms of her life. Does anybody want to add any points?
Yes, well, there's advantages, of course, in her dying when she did, as the poet Mandelstam said, Larisa died just in time. It allows the those experiences to be very pure and fresh. And then I could just do that final chapter at the end, which I called Afterlife, about what happened to everybody. And, you know, Sezgin asked once what would have happened to her. I'm absolutely convinced she would have ended up in a camp, you know. So that's what Mandelstam meant when he said she died just in time. Because, you know, her penultimate work, which I think perhaps is my favorite, which is Kola and the Living People, I think it's an incredibly important book, and incredibly truthful and from the moment. But, you know, she foresaw so many of the achievements, the mighty achievements and the terrible sacrifices and injustices, you know, of the 30s. We can talk about, I do talk a little bit about that, and the war economy and the build up to war, and Hitler. She died before the camps, she died before Hitler.
I mean, one of the things for me, Cathy, that was really interesting reading the biography, is the biography takes a relatively narrative form. It's a chronological form. It's a sort of intellectual biography, as we'd expect. But that second to last chapter, How Extraordinary to Be Alive, is a very interesting way of summing up. And then, of course, you get the final chapter, Afterlife. But I think that's very much a tidying up. But to sum up someone's life in that sort of title of a chapter, How Extraordinary to Be Alive, because it was an extraordinary life.
Yes, yes. Hey, you can feel it, can't you?
Mm.
Yes, I certainly did. Yes.
And the beauty of your two texts, first the biography, then getting into the writings in the context of the biography, and then anticipating the Decembrist publication, really does show that we should be giving this thinker a renaissance. We should be actually going back to this thinker again. And again, I think all too often the scholastic situation of many on the left means that there is a rush to produce new insight, when we should remember most of what this new insight is retrieving old insight, properly situating. And I mean, that's one of the many criticisms you can make of a sort of scholastic situation of much of what is written around Marxism.
Yes. Well, that's why I was guided throughout by her own writings, because I didn't have to say anything. I just wanted her to speak for herself, actually. I did intervene a little bit, you know, when it seemed appropriate, but on the whole, I think she just writes you know, she writes about herself, but she's writing herself out of the story at the same time, which is so interesting. So, you know, and all these dialectical complications are so, that you talk about, Alex, are so interesting too. You know, this charismatic leader of women who spoke for women in all her writings, who was never ever remotely, you know, involved in the women's liberation movement in Russia. So, and, you know, I'm sure, I don't know, I mean, she did have correspondence with Kollontai, interesting correspondence, but, you know, I'm quite sure that she would not have supported many of the things that Kollontai was fighting for, such as, you know, women's commissions, even the Zhenachel. She was not terribly interested in Zhenachel politics, actually. It's more interested in poetry.
But that in itself is an interesting insight, because all too often I think people read Marxist feminists and assume all they have to say is about Marxist feminism. when
Yeah.
what we should be talking about are women who talk about a range of different things, including women, but also very much including other things.
Yes. Yes.
Have you any last words? We're coming near the end of the broadcast. Do you want, I mean, Cathy, Sagan, or Alex, have you any last bon mot with which to charm us?
No.
Okay. Alex?
For me, it's mostly just sincere thanks to Cathy for all of her work
Same here.
on this. It has Reissner deserves a far bigger audience for all the reasons we've talked about here, and far more. So I feel very privileged to have participated in this discussion, and very lucky to have been had to run into someone like Cathy in my life who says, like, you need to read this person. I'm gladly I'm a better Marxist and a better writer for it. And this is just something saying just with a few months of retrospect. So thank you, Cathy, and thank you for everyone for all of this.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's bring this to a close. I mean, we can thank Cathy certainly for retrieving Reissner from an uncertain and somewhat unknown history, but let's also remember her other great work has been Kollontai. I don't think you can read Kollontai in the English language without reading Cathy. Thanks very much for listening to the broadcast. I hope you found it enlightening and interesting. I certainly have. Historical materialism has a number of different activities. We have networks on disability and sexuality and political economy. We have these broadcasts. We have podcasts, which are very close to the journal content. We have the book series broadcast with Haymarket, and we're always grateful for the support Haymarket give us. We have the further broadcasts on the new HM website, and I would encourage you to Google and go to the HM website and see what we've got on that. And of course, we have the journal now in its 30-odd volumes, an implacable force intellectually, and given the number of pages per issue, extraordinarily good value if you'd like to subscribe. And of course, the book series, of which we've been talking about tonight, which comes out with Brill on the hardback, if that's your inclination, and then Haymarket on the softback. And we normally launch in this way on the softback. Please support historical materialism. It is run entirely almost on militant labour. So we have very, very few means of raising finance. So if you can solidarity donate, do. But even coming and listening to broadcasts like